Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday afternoon as we bring to you a topic to address the governance and legal considerations for responsible AI and implementation put on and produced by NAIIC, the Nursing and AI Innovation Consortium. My name is Rebecca Love, and it is a pleasure to be here with two incredibly leading individuals in this space who are going to be having this conversation with us, which is Dr. Jing Wang, the Dean of Nursing at Florida State University, who is accompanied by Brenton Hill, the Head of Operations and the Lead General Counsel for CHAI, otherwise known for the Coalition of Healthcare AI. We understand this will be the first of such presentation in front of nursing to talk about the importance of what's going on with the legal installations for nursing and all healthcare professionals. The first part of this conversation we're having is going to be a presentation to give you the information that you need, which we will then open up for comments and questions. Please feel free to put those in your chats, engage with us directly, and if we don't get to them during the presentation, we have left time behind to answer and engage with all of you at the end of this, of what we believe is probably going to be one of the most important conversations of our time based on what's going on. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wang, and it's to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. Next slide. We'll show you, really, it's about, I think 2 years ago, I met Rebecca in person. We kind of started an idea that we really need to find an organization that really bring all of the nurses together and nursing voices together so we can elevate nursing and amplify all the nursing voices in the era of AI in healthcare, which is everywhere. So it's free membership. We already have a lot of leading nursing organizations such as American Nurses Association, American Association of Colleges of Nursing, American Organization of Nurse Leaders, and a lot of healthcare systems and others, individuals, nursing schools join us. We have about over 100 individual and organizational members. So really would encourage all of you. We'll be sharing the slides and every information with all of our members. So whether you're nurses, nurse leaders, or just people who work in healthcare are really interested in supporting nursing in this area, feel free to join us. Also wanted you to know that I think in the last session that Miraj and Rebecca really talk about responsible AI. But if you are looking for more in-depth training, CHAI, the Coalition for Health AI, and the Consortium of Florida State University, we developed this micro-credential materials for all of you to have more in-depth knowledge and training in this area. If you're ever interested, here are some of the information. Next. So I think I want to start with, before we dive into sort of the legal aspect and considerations, I want to add a little bit more in addition to what was covered last session about the broad context of legal governance. Really, we have really observed just really rapid and acceleration of AI adoption in healthcare, be it in clinical decision support, documentation, workflow redesign, or patient monitoring. It is so fast in a way there's also policy momentum at the federal level. And here are just some of the documents and tools that you can always refer back to or watch these organizations as they update, because these will impact how you develop in governments. We talk about governance is global, governance is also local, and that's why we would like to have more conversations with all of you on these topics. But another recent document that we want all of you to focus on is the World Health Organization. Really, we extract some of the information. World Health Organization have these specific implementation tools for governance where you can sort of readily use as you consider, in addition to what CHAI has provided, such as the ethical impact assessment, human rights impact assessment for those of you who really work with individuals, with marginalized patient groups, public engagement, in our case, really for our patients, and also developers and, whatever at the federal level, at the state level that supports health and Department of Health in the United States. And specifically for nursing leadership, we think that World Health Organization, when they set these ethics and governance frameworks, really including all of our nurses, to include all these 6 principles, ethical norms at every stage including development, deployment, and use. So we encourage nursing leadership to consider championing AI oversight committees within your own organizations and require these ethical impact assessment tools to be implemented and ensure our patients and communities are engaged in these design and informed, especially as a nurse, as a bedside nurse, informed when AI directly impacts their care, that disclosure, and also how you can actually leverage these 6 principles into the AI literacy curriculum or nursing orientation, be it you are in a nursing school or in a healthcare system. Next, another tool that it is voluntary, but our National Institute of Standards and Technology also defines AI and develop this life cycle oriented framework from, where are all those risks sits and how we really need to develop this cross-cutting governance at all stages, all lifestyle cycles stages. And for each stage, also consider mapping, measure, and manage. And it's an iterative process. It is not just a one-time process. Hey, we have this committee that meet one time, decided that we're going to adopt this AI tool, and then we stop there. And even for mapping out, how do we document some of these risks and identify who are the specific stakeholders and categories of potential harm across the AI system lifecycle that may happen? How do we map it out? And how do we measure it according to the different stakeholders? Being valid, reliable, safe, secure, accountable, explainable, privacy enhanced, or bias managed? And how do we really provide the specific measures? And here are all, we'll have all these references and documents you can go back into. And here is just to provide you some of the broad introduction to these frameworks with specific tools that you can actually use to develop your local governance model. And most importantly is that manage component in this particular framework is that people think that deployment of an AI solution was all the preparation work and we just stop there and everything would just work perfectly. And as a nurse, you know that's not the case. So the post-deployment monitoring, and especially with the AI tools in place, be it autonomous or agentic or clinical decision support, what does this appeal and override mechanism lie in? And what is sort of the decommissioning about maybe this is just not working anymore, no matter how much effort that we put in it, and how the change management, particularly for nursing leaders and nursing executives, you understand, be it it's an AI or non-AI solution that is added to our workflow, it is a change management process in addition to actually adding the tool. So these are some of the frameworks we want to also provide all of you as a reference tool. Next. And then the third one we want to introduce to you, especially for those of you who work in healthcare systems, that you get surveys now and then to be prepared that CHIA has collaborated with the Joint Admission that released the responsible use of AI in healthcare that really supported that we need to have formal oversight with actually board level accountability. And how do we as nurses or nurse leaders to ensure that the AI use is being disclosed and ensure it's implemented across the nursing enterprise? In what condition we have to notify patients when AI directly impacts care. Remember the wording. We know there are a lot of AI tools that are in healthcare, but are like in revenue cycle management or administrative that doesn't really impact the care. So there are some differentiations there. Also, HIPAA compliance. It's not that we can ignore everything that's already in place. Encryption, especially make sure for those of you who are in nursing leadership roles to ensure that there are business, associate agreement in place with all of the vendors. You may think you do. Actually, there are some cases that are not. So what is your role to make sure that actually happens? We talk about ongoing quality monitoring. Really, it's a continuous performance validation process. Post-deployment is not one time. It has to be a continuous process. Voluntary blinded safe event reporting. Many nurses are very familiar with patient safety organizations. We have to enable confidential reporting, but how does that kind of relate for all of these AI tools that are added into the workflow nowadays? Also, risk and bias assessment, leveraging the try apply model card between before and post deployment audits, and have an audit trail. So be sure you document and have a trail of documents that can support. And of course, education and training. Give you some more context, the Joint Commission. This was releasing around September last year, but it's voluntary framework, but it's also the formal framework and what you need to sort of get ready in terms of when you stand up the governance structure. Here are the stakeholders that at a minimum level you need to engage and involve. And what is the fiduciary board receives the regular updates and the tools that can inform your decisions. And most importantly, be ready for documenting the AI oversight, the validation, and the training protocols now, so you don't wait until the end and trying to go back to trace down those tools. Next one. So really overall, this is a kind of setting the stage for nurses, nurse leaders. We talk about the World Health Organization reports really establish about why all the ethics. We can keep talking about ethics every day, but going down to our everyday work, practically, what do we do at the bedside? What do we do in the health systems? What do we train our future nurses? So the NIST really defines how we do it, and we believe the Tri and Joint Commission report really operationalizes where. And what is most important that we want to talk with all of you today is that nursing leadership really decide when and governs throughout these processes. We really believe that nurses should and must not wait to be governed, and really need to sort of lead the governance and claim that decision authority at every stage of the AI lifecycle. And specifically, we encourage all of you to serve on AI governance committees across all of the frameworks. Drive the development with some of these tools that are readily available. Again, we talk about governance nowadays is no longer an academic exercise or aspirational theory. It is actually happening right now. There are frameworks that are out there, but there are also actually tools that are out there that you can leverage and you can use right now to develop what is needed to take care of the patients. If your organization decided, or if you are at the driver's seat or at the decision table in terms of like considering, developing, monitoring, or post deployment and prepare for surveys with Joint Commission, these are all the information that are already out there. And of course, there are many more there tools that are out there that you can use, but we just want to provide you a general framework about some of the important ones that are out there that can get you started if you haven't already had one. And how do you align these AI safety and monitoring reporting with what you're already doing with this patient safety organizations? That being said, without further ado, I want to introduce you and have you hear from Brenton, who is the Chief Operating Officer and Legal Counsel for CHI, and he has wealth of knowledge in these areas, and then we really dive into the legal considerations within all of these governance frameworks that we already have currently, and we may have more in the future as the field develops. So I'm going to have Brenton start, and I know he has a special guest to acknowledge as well. Brenton, all yours.
Thanks, Jing. So first wanted to start out, I think it's just paramount to say thank you, nurses. A couple of anecdotes that I have from my experience with nurses. One, my mom's a nurse at Unvita Health down in Yuma, Arizona, and get to hear a lot of the stories that she has. So Mom, if you're out there, thank you. Love all the work that you're doing, and thank you for prioritizing patient care. Second anecdote I want to share is during the pandemic, I had the interesting opportunity to spend 2 months in an emergency department at Ogden Regional Medical Center in Ogden, Utah. And I saw the countless hours nurses put in. I saw the struggles. I saw the compassion, the care, and all the great things that you all do on a day in, day out basis. So thank you. I know it's hard. I know it's difficult. And I think the promise of AI is hopefully prioritizing how we can start to simplify a lot of those pain points that you have as nurses and really get back to focusing on what nurses love most, taking care of people, prioritizing patients, and getting people the care that they need and doing that coordination. So again, thank you, and looking forward to this. I thought it's helpful. I think a lot of the times we start with, okay, we're going to focus on legal stuff. Let's get down to legal stuff. I always like to start with a general baseline knowledge of just AI 101. What do you need to focus on? What do you need to know? I'm not a technologist myself. I come from a hospital administration background, a legal background. So being in the AI space, I can't say that I have an in-depth understanding of the technology. And so I wanted to share with you just how you can start to learn about the technology a little bit more and demystify some of the conceptions that are out there, and really understand the technology at the level that you need to in order to have success. So, this slide is basically here to demonstrate, okay, AI has been around for a while. Mechanistic models have been around since the 60s, right? So things like predicting drugs and predicting certain things, this type of technology has been in use for decades. And really, it's math. And the math has been paired up with technology to make it more efficient, to make it more powerful. But if you look at all of these use cases, if you look at all of the things that are coming out in the AI space and by the research labs and in academia, really what we should be focusing on is, okay, there's more data and there's more systems, which means it's becoming more complex. The opportunity for error is becoming more, and we need to figure out how to insert human decision into the workflows to make sure that we're successful and protect ourselves. So that's really where I'm coming from today is, don't focus on all the hype. Don't focus on all the stuff that's in the news. Focus on, okay, if I'm dealing with AI agents, there's going to be automatic decisions. There's going to be more data in play. There's going to be more systems in play. And so how do I get back to the basics of focusing on, okay, how do I make sure that I'm practicing at the top of my license and having technology enable that? One of the things that we keep hearing about is clinical information, clinical evidence, and there's a flood of tools out there that are starting to help clinicians, both nurses and physicians, really get clinical information and evidence at the tips of their fingers. And so historically, what's been interesting is, you've had a clinical question historically. Traditionally, you've gone to books, journals, guidelines. In the age of the internet, when all that was put on the internet, Google, PubMed, websites, different things. But where AI is starting to transform that is, one, you have general purpose large language models. And really what you need to think about those is it's ChatGPT, it's Claude, it's Gemini. It's tools that are trained to do a wide variety of tasks. And you can ask it a question, it's going to give you a response. So those are starting to be used for some clinical questions. We all know that's happening, whether we wanted to admit it or not. But we also have point solutions that are optimized for clinical questions. And so you may ask, okay, what's the difference between these two tools? How do I know when to use one? What I'll say is the main difference here is really where they're sourcing their information from. So if you think about a typical large language model, it's been trained on the internet, right? It has a breadth and a depth of information. When you think about, okay, open evidence, doximity, up-to-date, more of these clinical point solutions, the advantage they have is that they're sourcing academic journals and they're actually licensing that content from those providers. And so whereas, ChatGPT, you ask, it might have some access to PubMed, it might have some access to some good information. What you're getting with the open evidences, the doximities, the up-to-dates, is you're getting licensed content from the producers of such content, such that okay, this has been peer reviewed, it's accurate, it's the latest information, it's the greatest information. And so as you're thinking about, what tool do I use, how do I know what to use, go back to, where they're sourcing their information from, where they're licensing their information from, what agreements that they have, and that will help you know what tool to use, right? ChatGPT is starting to license some of the content. But again, as Jean mentioned, it's critical as we start to think about how are we putting information, what information are we putting in it? Do we have the proper legal and safeguards so that we're not violating HIPAA? Right. If you want specific guidance on a specific patient and you want to use open evidence, for example, well, if you're going to be putting in PHI, you better well make sure that you have that business associate agreement, because that's probably the biggest mistake that we're seeing right now is people just forgetting that, hey, I still have HIPAA obligations, and these tools are great, but we still need to use them responsibly. So that's big. The other thing I want to bring in just from an overall AI education standpoint is context is key in the AI space. So if you know anything about the tools, what you'll know is that the model or the AI itself, it can be accessed through what's called an API. And an API is just basically a gateway that gives you access to a piece of technology more seamlessly. And so a lot of tools today are actually accessing the same models and just pulling it in different formats. So let's take open evidence, for example. Essentially what open evidence is an application that orchestrates connection to a large language model, which helps it reason, but then pulls in the evidence to actually help surface that recommendation, such and so forth. And so when you're thinking about, okay, why am I not getting the right answer that I need? Why is my prompt to this model not surfacing what I hope, or can I trust the output? What you should really be thinking is, okay, there's all this possible context that we could be feeding the model, but we need to be thinking about how are we optimizing context for the model. And there's been some interesting research out of Stanford, and I'll quote Ethan Go here, who's really at the forefront of thinking about this, and they're doing some great testing, and we'll go into a little bit of how they're testing further. But he said, giving an AI system more context is not always better. Oftentimes you'll hear data, good data equals good output. Well, it's not that simple. It's the right data that is good is going to give you the right output. And so what we can't expect is to say, hey, we're going to put all this data in there and we're going to get this great output. No, it needs to be the right data at the right point for the right type of solution that's going to get you that optimal output. So think about that the next time you prompt your open evidence or your ChatGPT, because I think the better people know the technology, the more effectively we can use it. And then as we start to think about, okay, what's the difference between a generative AI product and an agentic AI product? Really, the key difference is the level of sophistication and the level of systems and orchestration that's being done there. So a key example here, let's take ambient dictation. A lot of you may be using this in your nursing practice today. I hope you're using this. I hope that your facilities and your hospital and your health systems are allowing you to use this, because it's a technology that's changing the game for a lot of providers. But when you think about an ambient scribe or an ambient solution, really what it's doing is it's taking in the context, that conversation, it's interpreting it, that transcript, through a large language model, and then it's producing a note that you can sign off with and put it in the EHR, right? If you think about it, fairly simple, fairly straightforward. Of course, the technology is a little complicated, but the idea, okay, we can all live with that. When you think about agents, though, what's happening is you're getting now multiple data sources. So it might be the EHR, it might be the lab, it might be the vitals monitoring system. And again, this is fictitious. It's not a real solution, but I want to just highlight the complexity here. And then you're getting an AI agent that can actually act autonomously on your behalf. And then now that's surfacing recommendations or performing a task on your behalf. You're gonna wanna be a part of that process, because ultimately the AI doesn't have a license. It's not the AI's license on the line. It's your license. It's your decision. It's your patient. And so, as you think about how you're starting to use tools, and even in the ambient dictation and scribe space, they're starting to layer in functionalities to make them more like AI agents. So now ambient scribes are trying to market, okay, we can listen to the entire conversation and we can suggest codes. We can suggest different insights. We can do a number of clinical decision support type of functionalities. And now that's starting to get into, okay, well, I don't want you to make all the decisions on my behalf. Where do I fit in? Where do I make the decision? Those types of configurations in your workflows and in the products need to be considered. And I think if you have a voice at the table, if you care about this, I think it's a great thing to talk to your leaders about. If you are a leader, it's a great thing to really surface to your AI officer or your CIO or your governing AI body, because these types of decisions and considerations are going to be critical. Now, I mentioned bringing in some research. I think what's interesting is there's research being done on these large language models, and they're testing on specific tasks within the EHR. So let's say lab results lookup, vital sign retrieval, et cetera, et cetera. And they're starting to do some independent tests. And what they're finding is, at best, these large language models overall have have about a 70% success rate on tasks. So in the specific diagram, if you'll see here, over to the right, you'll see, an overall success rate, a query success rate, and then an action success rate. And essentially what this means is that the large language model querying, a lab results lookup in the EHR, Claude 3.5 Sonnet version 2 was successful 85% of the time. Pretty good, right? We think about technology. But when it was asked to perform an action, that dropped down significantly to 50% of the time that it had that success rate. And we'll see Gemini, was a leader here. So when we think about, okay, we're excited to use these tools, what does it mean? Well, in reality, we're finding that real clinical tasks by real clinicians done with real data, these still aren't optimal. These still aren't 100% accurate. And so, not to say that we need to stop using them, but proceed with caution, use them responsibly. Think about the considerations, look at the research, and before you go all in on the tools, understand the limitations and where you might need to fill in some gaps with your expertise as a human. Now, the compliance landscape, getting into a little bit more of the legal centric stuff, I think the compliance landscape is really confusing for people, because I think at the beginning of this AI boom, we were hoping that Congress and that the administration will come out and say, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Here's who's responsible for what. Here's what happens when the AI system breaks down. Here's who's liable. Here's who's not, et cetera, et cetera. We haven't gotten that level of detail yet. And this administration's position, right or wrong, take it as you see it. Their position is we want AI to flourish and proliferate. We want America to lead in the AI space, and they see regulation and rules as a potential hindrance. And so oftentimes what we're finding is our hospital and health system colleagues and even our clinician stakeholders out there are a little confused on what are my obligations right now in the space in this gray area. And so I want to highlight those. There may be a few more, there may be a few less. This is my interpretation of it. Again, this isn't legal advice. Ask your compliance and your legal leaders. But as I see it, there's certain scenarios where different legal obligations are in play. So let's take triaging and intake, right, for AI, QD, and risk scoring. And then we're mapping those to the NIST attributes that Jean had mentioned. Really we're thinking about, okay, as we're triaging and doing certain things, there's legal obligations in the ADA space, the disability space. There's legal obligations in Section 1557 and 504 around bias and fairness and some of those measures. Whether those are enforced, we're not sure yet. It really depends on whether the administration in the Department of Justice would enforce such measures, but you do have some current obligations in those specific provisions, and I'm not going to go into those in depth, but again, something to flag for the research on your own. And then assessment and monitoring, clinical decision support, right? When you think about the NIST attribute of safe, really your legal obligation right there is to make sure that you're not committing malpractice or negligence in these scenarios. And so when you're using a tool for early warning or sepsis alerts, right, you need to make sure that you're using it safely, that you've done the proper vetting of the tool, you understand the limitations of the tool, and that you're using it in conjunction with your clinical expertise and making sure that you don't commit malpractice or have a negligence suit against you. And then, of course, as we think about clinical decision support, ambient scribes, care recommendations, et cetera, the AI should be explainable and accountable. Your main consideration here is do we need informed consent or disclosure? And then what is the standard of care? Has our board of nursing dictated a standard of care? Is the industry saying that we need to be using these tools and that you're not following the standard of care if you're not? So those need to be in contemplation as you think about those things as well. And then documentation, medical administration, patient communication, you're going to have HIPAA and security rules in there. Again, you're going to have some mapping to negligence, and then informed consent. And so I would think about these not in terms of any new obligations that have been forced upon you from a federal or state perspective. Your states may have some state-specific regulations out there. It's hard to tell because the bar is moving. There's a lot of proposed legislation. There's not a lot of legislation in force. But you should be thinking about, okay, I already have these existing obligations that I know about that are in force today. How does AI retroactively or proactively fit into those situations? And how do I make sure that my use of the technology is in alignment with those? And that's what I want the big takeaway here to be, is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to make sure that we are focusing on our existing obligations and then tying the technology into that. Now, as I was doing a little bit of research on this, I think it was interesting that the Texas Board of Nursing proposed a new position statement around AI in 2024. And this was really the most recent authoritative guidance that I could find on AI in nursing. Now, the ANA has produced some documents. There's been some other guidance, but it hasn't been concrete and clear what an expectation would be. And so what the Texas Board of Nursing, and again, if you're not in Texas, may not be applicable, but I think this highlights a general trend to where this could go from an overall boards of nursing's perspective. But what they're saying your professional responsibility obligations would be is to know, the laws and policies, and that's not just laws and policies from a federal and state perspective, but you should ultimately know the Board of Nursing, what the policies there, and then your organizational specific policies. You need to understand those. You need to understand that when your system outlaws the use of ChatGPT on personal cellular devices, you shouldn't be doing that, right? So that's the expectation as Texas is contemplating it. Keeping patients safe, right? And I think that really aligns with what we've talked about. Protecting privacy. You need to follow HIPAA. You need to understand the implications of where the information is going in these models and how it could potentially be leveraged from that standpoint. You need to be able to educate patients. You need to educate patients on AI's role in their care, on how AI is being used in the care, and ultimately how that's going. Maintain your competency. Guard against bias, making sure you're not using tools that may have been trained on a certain subset of data, may not be performing optimally on your patient population. And we know historically there's been a lot of considerations, a lot of talk out there about tools that have been trained traditionally on coastal Caucasian populations. And typically in the research, when those tools are applied to minority populations, they tend to not perform as well. And so if you're using tools that, gosh, we never did the research, we never saw how the developer trained or validated on it, it could be difficult from that perspective and ultimately subject you to some unintended consequences. And then I thought the most interesting part of this was question and clarify. So Texas is encouraging, again, proposing a position statement, but they would be encouraging nurses to challenge inaccurate AI-driven orders and collaborate with the team. So ultimately, they're focusing on you as a nurse. You have the responsibility ultimately for the decision. And if you think an AI recommendation is inaccurate or inappropriate, that responsibility, that accountability still falls on you as a nurse. And that's consistent with what we've seen for physicians on their medical boards as well. Ultimately, in the physician space, what the Federation of State Medical Boards position has always been since 2022, actually, has been that the clinicians are always responsible for the decisions, regardless of whether AI is being used in that, and physicians will be held liable. And so what I'm seeing here, while not explicitly stating that, I'm seeing a little bit of similar parallels to in the Texas Board of Nursing, and my guess is that's where this is going, right? Is that you as nurses need to be responsible in using the tools and how you're doing it. So how do I use it responsibly? Well, I think the best thing that a nurse could do in this environment is know what questions to ask. As attorneys in law school, we're trained. We're not necessarily trained in all the law. We don't know all the answers, but we're trained to know the questions to ask. And so I wanted to go over some quick hitting questions that you can ask as you're presented with tools to make sure that you're understanding them. So the questions are a little bit different. I separated them out in terms of Gen AI, agentic. I think you could ask questions, I think you could intermix these. But first and foremost, you need to understand what large language model a tool is using, right? And we'll go over this in a little bit of detail in terms of some recent litigation for large language models, but there are certain large language models that aren't necessarily performing optimally. We've heard a lot about ChatGPT in the news, where it's suggesting that, hey, you should end your life, or you should do certain things. And if you're using a tool that's relying on a large language model that maybe you're not comfortable with, or that you're not aligned with, or that you don't think is going to give you the recommendations, you should probably know that. How is institutional information processed? Is it recording? Is it transcripts? Is it draft copies, right? If informational or if institutional information is being processed in certain ways, it actually has specific legal triggers. Again, we'll go over some recent litigation, but in certain states, recordings, there's wiretapping laws that actually dictate how you consent people to get recordings. And so you should know, okay, how is it processing the information, and what questions should I be asking? And then I think of, again, going back to training data and context, you should know, what were the training data, and then what contextual information is needed to provide optimal responses. And then when you think about AI agents, I think some of the most important questions we should ask is, does it respond when a clinician asks, or continuously monitor data and act on its own? So you should know, okay, when is a human expected to act in the workflow? And then when is that agent making decisions? Because you'll want to know, okay, when information is surfaced to me, have humans reviewed it? When am I supposed to review it? And then how do I make sure the accuracy is there, and all that good stuff? How many separate systems does it connect with? If any of you have used Claude Cowork, for example, either personally or in work-related contexts, you'll know that Claude Cowork now has hundreds of different connectors to different systems, right? And so potentially, if you're trying to solve a problem, and your system has 20 different tools connected to Claude Code, and all of a sudden it's pulling from those different contexts and those different systems, you could have millions of data points in a single interaction with AI. And if it's not pulling the right context, if it's not pulling the right information, if it's not giving you the complete picture, you might be really confused about, okay, how did it make the recommendation? Where did it pull? So you need insights into those different data sources and how it's retrieving that information wrong. And then I think one of the most important things, again, that we could consider here is when the output is wrong or unexpected or something that I don't agree with, how is it caught, corrected, or reported to any overseers, right? So what are the risk mitigation steps, and how do we do that? Do I report to my superiors? Do I need to contact the company directly? You need to know how to do that, because if there's no process, then ultimately you could find yourself in a situation where you're being framed as the one that made a decision and you were the one in the wrong, when, hey, I had this recommendation, I didn't know what to do with it, I didn't have anyone to contact. There's a lot there that could happen, and I think one of the ways that you can protect yourself most is just knowing the chain of authority to go to when something goes wrong. So again, some context there. Jing mentioned model cards. I wanted to quickly touch on model cards. Model cards are basically a way for developers to disclose pertinent information about them. So very complicated. We're not going to go in depth on this. But if you look at, if you request a model card for a developer, what you should know about it is how is the solution or model intended to be used? How was it trained? What are some warnings about it? How did you test and validate during your processes? And are there any additional considerations? So as you think about, okay, how do I get those questions? Is there a standard format I could ask those in? Typically, what we're seeing out on the market is some sort of model card or nutrition label, and we'd be happy to distribute, kind of how you go about that and do that type of stuff. When you look at model cards, I found myself nerding out on model cards one night, and I looked at the model cards of ChatGPT and Claude, which are actually all publicly facing. And what you'll see, and what I think is really interesting, again, not going to go in depth on this, but the testing processes that ChatGPT and Claude are going through are really testing centered on disallowed content, hallucinations, self-extreme harm, illicit content, et cetera, et cetera. You'll see here, ChatGPT does have health bench. They do have health considerations that they're training, But Cloud for Healthcare, they aren't marketing their product as anything really clinical. They're marketing as more as administrative workflows. So as you think about using these, just recognize that the testing and the optimization of these products is to make sure that they don't get the company themselves in trouble. What ChatGPT and Claude are trying to optimize for is we don't want people harming themselves, we don't want people radicalizing themselves, and we don't want illicit content being generated through our means, but they're not optimizing for you as a nurse in your specific context, in your specific workflow with your specific patient. They're not optimizing for that. And so again, you need to be the decision maker. You need to understand where the tool has gaps and limitations, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Open Evidence, unfortunately, does not have a public facing model card. And so what I did is I actually went to their user guide and kind of surfaced it. But what's nice about Open Evidence, right, is they can point you directly to the sources of information that they are retrieving from. And so while helpful, may not be enough, but again, that level of information is helpful as you start to make decisions. And what's interesting is back in 2024, again, a couple of years ago, haven't seen much research sent on this, but they found that there's potential of LLMs in the clinical space, but none of them are effective enough for clinical settings yet. Right. And so something that we should be aware of. The researchers are saying, there's a lot of potential here. However, they're still not truly effective enough to be using extensively in clinical settings. And just because a tool is a point, so going back to this kind of discussion, just because a tool is aimed like Open Evidence for clinical users doesn't mean that it doesn't have any risk. So don't take it to mean that, hey, I'm using Open Evidence, they have great content, they've licensed all the right content, there's no risk in me using it. There still is some things that can go wrong in that. It can still retrieve the wrong information, it can still misinterpret the context. And so be aware that just because a tool has the right sources of data doesn't mean it is risk proof or that there is no risk in using it. Quickly wanted to go through it, and again, I think this can largely be studied on your own. But essentially, what I did here is I put those professional responsibility obligations from the Texas Board of Nursing back into some risks that we have. And so you'll see here, when you're promoting a safe work environment, clarifying questionable orders, that the AI risk there is accurate or hallucinated outputs. Again, PHI exposure, there's stuff there. Can't explain AI's roles to the patient education. There are different risks here. I'm not going to go through this extensively. I think it's repetitive on some of the other information that we've presented here. But I think mapping your responsibilities to some AI risk is going to be critical, right? This is a personal exercise that I think everyone can do. And even organizationally, as you think about it, being a nurse leader, right? If you think about all the risks that you can identify today and then map those to your responsibilities, to your organizational policies, and then really figure out the right ways to control and to configure your AI use, that's a nice exercise that everyone can do in the industry to make sure that you're protected. Now for some fun stuff. So some recent litigation here. Again, not going to go into depth on any of these, but I want you to know about where the cases are trending, where the lawsuits are, what people are suing for. Again, there's no results yet, but I find it really interesting. So state of Florida, again, I think this is fairly new. I think this is a number of weeks ago, but the state of Florida sued ChatGPT for risks, including to children, and concealing serious risks around self-harm, addiction, data collection for minors, right? So this is really a minor-centric suit. But again, as we've seen, people have harmed themselves using these tools, and so Florida is leading the way in kind of challenging. Okay, are these tools actually safe and effective? Should these be released to the public? There's another one. There's another one actually more interesting and more tailored to the kind of clinical context. So there was a college student, again, I forget which college, but there was a college student who used ChatGPT to gain personalized drug and medical advice. And what happened was ChatGPT recommended 2 drugs that were actually contradictive. And the patient ended up dying because he took 2 substances that interacted poorly, ultimately killing him. And so when we think about, again, where are we sourcing the information? What are we doing? ChatGPT does not have extensive knowledge about the contraindications, about the interactions, right? I think it'll get there at some point, but right now it's just not there. So don't be using it for extensive clinical questions. Again, use your clinical judgment and go from there. And then the last one I'll mention here that I think is interesting and very pertinent is there was a class action that sued Sharp Healthcare out in California around the consent process that they had around ambient scribes. And I mentioned, two-party recording. There's wiretapping statutes out there that differ state by state. But essentially what the plaintiff is asserting here is that, hey, you claim in the medical note that you got my consent for recording every single interaction. And plaintiff Saucedo here is saying, no, that never happened. I never consented. I had no idea. When I looked at my medical record, all of a sudden it said I consented, and so it's challenging it. And so Jean mentioned audit trails monitoring. One of the key things that we can do here is establish the audit trails such that, when it's patient against nurse or patient against hospital, and there's two differing, stories or anecdotes there, that we do have an audit trail to say, no, in fact, we did consent the patient at standard. We have it in the forms. We have it in different things. And there's a number of things that we could be doing there. So again, a nice little call out and something that I think we should all be considering. Liability, again, one of the trending topics that we have here that we're looking at. What's interesting about liability and some things, there's no clear indication about where liability is going to fall yet. And some things that have been coming out of Stanford, again, Stanford, the law department, they've been writing extensively about liability in AI. What's interesting is AI is still falling under traditional software as service liability. So in software as a service, for example, most of the liability, and courts have assessed this, courts have assessed the liability generally falling on the users because the users provide the context, the users use it in a certain way. And ultimately, if something goes wrong, they're going to pin the liability on the user from that standpoint. And so, again, courts do not currently distinguish AI from traditional software. I think that might be changing. There are some suits that are coming out that are challenging this narrative. But again, in the current case law index and the current state of the law, it's not on your side as a user of AI. And so you should think about that. You should think about how you're using it. And so as you think about, how am I assessing my risk, there's 4 things that Dr. Mello recommends in her paper around this. It's, contemplate the likelihood and the nature of the errors. So ask the right questions, contemplate, if I'm going to use this tool, what's the likelihood and nature of the error? And how do I mitigate those errors? How am I going to detect error? How are humans in the loop? How are humans configured to make the decisions in the AI context? What's the severity of the harm if I'm caught? We've all probably heard about the sepsis model that was produced a few years ago that was 50% accurate. We all know sepsis is deadly if it's not caught, right? So if you're using a sepsis model and materially relying on that model to make judgments and assessments around sepsis, and it's 50% accurate, well, the harm severity dramatically increases. And so you're going to want to make sure that the tool you're using is very accurate for the intended purpose, for the intended use. And then what's the litigation viability? And again, this is something that your legal counsel can think about. But, in lawyers that I talk to around the industry, what they're thinking about is, okay, if we got caught using a tool and something went wrong, is it going to make front headline news? How many people are going to be able to sue for it? And how are we mitigating litigation viability? We all know lawsuits are going to happen. You can't control when a person sues you for this, but what you can control is the amount of risk you're taking on in those situations. You can control how you're mitigating those risks operationally and through contracts and through other things. And so that's something that I think everyone should be thinking. And then rounding us out here, because I want to save time to answer some questions here. There's a lot of ways that you can mitigate risk. We've already talked with a lot of these. But something interesting, I was seeing some comments in ambient scribes, for example. So one of the things that I can't be understated is in the consent space, consent every voice. So in a lot of these interactions, right, you're going to have family members there. You're going to have not just the patients, but you're going to have caregivers. You might have, depending on the culture, you might have half the family there They're caring for the patient because that's the family dynamics in that culture. And so anyone who's part of that interaction being recorded needs to be consented, which is, I think, a great tip that we should have. And then, if not everyone consents, just don't use the tool in that instance, and you're going to have to do the charting as you've done hitherto, but something to think about. And then, as we think about a lot of the other risk mitigation strategies, a lot of these can be done through contracting. Audit logs, I'll spend a little bit of time on this because I think it's important to note. This is going to be very, very technically centric. So this isn't something that you as a nurse can just go and build on your own. This is something that you are going to have to work with your enterprise team on, because this takes a level of architecture and a level of capture that just isn't possible for any one human to do. And so I think it's important to know that this is a team game. A lot of these mitigation strategies you can do on your own. A lot of them you're going to have to take and actually retroactively do with your team and with your governance group. And so don't take this as a, gosh, I have to worry about all of this and figure all this out on my own. No, these are things that you can flag for your teams. These are things that you can flag for your leaders. And these are things that you can force the conversation on to help make them happen. So I wanted to leave you with 5 practical tips as we kind of end here and start to take some questions. Always get consent and disclose, especially if those interactions are taking place face-to-face, right? At this stage of the game, I think we can consent and disclose and just make sure people are comfortable with FAA. Safeguard PHI. Monitor and audit with your institution. Keep a real human in the loop. Don't get lazy. Automation bias sets in. We all know that as humans, tend to rely on technology. We all get a little bit lazy. Don't fall into those patterns of automation bias. And then force the issue. Configure the tools to fit you. Don't let the developers create the tools that they think are going to work for you. Work with the developers. Work with your teams and configure tools to meet your workflows, to meet your work styles, and ultimately to meet your needs as an organization. So wanted to end there. Happy to take any questions here and really, really appreciate the time.
Brenton, I think that was fantastic. I think that the information that you presented is very good. There are a number of questions that I think that people are encouraged about. One of them, bringing back to the idea of ambient listening and scribing and recording of conversations. Do patients have the right to the complete recording as opposed to what is just being put as a note in the final transcribing? Because at this point in time, right, anytime that AI engages with a patient, there has to be 100% transcription of that conversation for the LLM to work. I don't know if people know that. You have to record every conversation verbally, and it is put down into a physical transcript that then is then fed into a machine to look at that transcript, consolidate it based on the engagements that are being put forward to capture that note. But the question also, I have a question, that seems to be coming out there is, you may have the transcript and those you have the note, but they are not identical. What do patients have the right to? What do you as a clinician have right to? How long does one have to maintain a copy of either the recording, the voice recording, the conversation, the actual transcript, and then also to the note? Is there any information around that space currently?
So I'll say what I know, but there's also a lot that I don't know. I'll just be honest here. So what I do know is that right now, well, one, what I would say is different solutions have different recording types, right? So there are a lot of solutions that will record the conversation, put it through a large language model, and then that offers a transcript, right? There are also a lot of solutions that just do live transcription on the voice. So there's no recording, there's no data being produced there. It just does it live, and then that surfaces to it. So there's 2 types of mechanisms. Again, I don't know if that really matters for the analysis here, but something to think about. When we think about, okay, does the patient have the right to all this information? I still think that's a little bit unclear, right? We know that Congress and HHS has signed an information blocking rule into effect, right? So hospitals can't block patients from getting information about their records, right? We know that. Does that extend to all of the recordings and all the data? I'm not sure. And I don't know if we'll know until there's litigation. My guess is that every institution is going to have a different posture and policy on this, right? And so I think go with what your legal counsel has interpreted, go with what your organization's position is. But my guess is there's going to be varying opinions based on different interpretations of the statute, interpretations of the law, and I don't think there's a right answer there. However, when we think about the retention of these things, what I think is interesting is if you look at the orchestration of a lot of these ambient scribes, oftentimes there'll be a draft note, right? So there'd be a draft note that the large language model goes into, does whatever they want, to it, and then that surfaces the note that goes into the medical record. And what we're seeing is there are many organizations that are opting not to retain that draft note because it's not the final note. It's not what goes into the medical record. And so what we're seeing is at most organizations are retaining those for their typical data retention piece. So around 30 days is typically how they retain those. And most organizations in the space today are opting for their traditional data retention policies to make sure that they are, aligning with their organizational preferences around data. The other thing that we should be thinking about, okay, we have all this data, it would be great to keep it, is, data is expensive to store. These notes generate an enormous amount of data. It's large, it's expensive to store. And so it's likely not even feasible for your organization to think about, harnessing all this data. What they're really worried about is, are we meeting our HIPAA obligations in what we put in the medical record and ultimately having it from that standpoint? So not a lot of concrete answers. But again, I think following traditional data retention policies is what I'm seeing. And then making sure, obviously, that we're following the information blocking rules and just making sure that people have access to that is what I'm seeing as well. But yeah.
Thank you, Brenton. So it sounds like 30 days, which is a typical retention if you are a patient, is the amount of time that you would have time to request all of that information if it was something that was interesting. I think to your point, the California case will tell us a lot more. Mm-hmm. Can you also speak back to the question of consent and how does consent actually be obtained with regards to that? And what does it need to be? Is it written consent? Is it verbal consent? Does it need to be done on every visit? And does it need to be done if you're in the hospital and every time a nurse enters a room? Can you give us an idea of what consent may look like?
Yeah, again, what I'm seeing from many organizations is, one, you do need a consent every time you're recording, especially if you're in those wiretapping states, right? So nurse sitting in, patient comes in, hey, do I have your permission to record this conversation? We're using our AI, whatever your organization wants you to say, right? Do that. What I think isn't clear is how that's captured in the note, right? Because I think that the issue in the Sharp Healthcare case and what the plaintiff is saying is, hey, the hospital had boilerplate language that say consent was given. So that was automatically inserted into every note. And I think the real crux of the issue there is going to be whether, okay, how do you actually capture when consent was done? Is that, does a nurse type that in every time that happens? Do we have technology that, basically audits that and ensures that was done based on the recording? I don't know. My guess is organizations are probably now having their clinicians type in every time that they got consent instead of just having in that boilerplate language through the scribe. And so that would be my recommendation, right? Follow your organization's policy, but right now, especially if you're in a state with two-party recording and two-party consent, you're going to want to document that, through your keys, such that they can't claim that, hey, they just inserted this as boilerplate language and that was never actually gotten. Audit trails, as we begin to build audit trails in the industry, that's going to become more easily to track and trace. That's not something that's very main facing or that many organizations are able to do today because the level of sophistication required. So.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat about body language, facial expressions, and other nonverbal cues and communications that are often given, both in conversations. Sometimes what you say is actually not what you read in a transcript. We're looking at ambulatory spaces where you'll have a recorded conversation. There's a high level of auditing to make sure that what is actually transcribed is actually what is implied by that language. How is this going to change, Brenton, when you're dealing with sort of these non-common cues? Because as we know, right, large language models are written off of written word, not spoken language, and we're finding that sometimes these idiosyncrasies of that space is creating gaps in actual intent. And with those sort of things being this, what is your view on some of these situations, and how do we deal with this well-rounded environment, knowing that large language models are written on written language and not on how we normally engage directly with patients on a vault one? And Jing, happy to have you chime in here as well.
Great question. Yeah, I mean, you think about it's recording your voice. Now, as I've talked to technology companies, I think the technology is evolving enough to capture some of the inflections and some of our human dynamics more than we've seen before, right? Typical dictation is it just says the word. What I'm finding is I think the technology companies are starting to think about this, right? It's not going to take any nonverbal cues that people are giving, right? But I think the technology providers are acknowledging this. They're starting to figure out how to do it right. But at the end of the day, legal cases are all about intent, right? So if there's an issue, you're going to have to demonstrate what the intent was, and that's going to be factual. That's going to be largely not something that was seen in the note. That's going to be an issue of fact, and that's going to be the legal dispute, right? So my sense is that's where that goes, but not much we can do right now with the current state of the technology. But Jing, open to your ideas as well.
Yeah, I think it goes back to how we anticipate nurses to lead in what areas that we would like to use AI to support our work, right? If like we set our vision to be, this will save us time in typing the words, but it's not going to replace our thinking. It actually will give us more time to be communicating so I can actually notice more of those nonverbal, non-language cues so I can actually use what generative AI generated, and I can edit the notes to add those information, which is my interpretation. If I'm typing and I'm looking at the EHR versus I'm talking with the patient, probably I wouldn't be able to capture those cues. So I think it kind of goes back to, we're not like getting lazy just because those tools are already there that we stop paying attention. We actually need to train our nurses to be paying more attention. Now, there are tools that are out there documenting what you're saying. Now you can actually spending more time to capture those more like what we call human factors that is not captured by machines. And that's exactly where I would like to see the field moving forward, is that we got to define we talk about all of these legal considerations. It's not about, well, then I should never use any AI in my work because I have to consider all of these lawsuits and how do I defend myself in all of it. I think the goal is that we all get educated and we're learning day by day, and it's not new anymore. So we shouldn't really still be thinking, okay, what are those implications? Is we need to dive down deeper to really define, here are the repetitive tasks that are boring tasks that are taking our nurses time away, that we actually can use more of the AI assistance to give like our nurses more time to focus on the human factors and focus on that human centered care. I think it is a complicated question, and I think the answer will be complicated. And that's exactly where we need to focus more efforts in moving the field forward, because I think nurses have the expertise and talent to actually dive deeper, to narrow down to cases and areas where we should more rely on or depend on AI, and what other areas it can enhance our work and give us time back to focus on the patient needs.
No, well said, Jing. And actually, there's another comment in there that, hospitals are already rapidly rolling these out, but many nurses are feeling like there is no education and compliance for nurses. And based on the boards of nursing saying that nurses are going to be held accountable for inaccurate information, and Brent and I don't know, and Jing, you guys are probably well aware, a report just came out that many of healthcare AI companies, due to the rising cost of tokens to engage in LLMs based in the US or Europe, are actually moving to LLMs that are based in China or in other places around the world to drive their agentic AI. The question that becomes is many nurses, based on recent studies, and in fact, the largest protest ever done of nurses at Kaiser, were actually saying that they do not have the ability to challenge AI systems at their hospital institution or adjust what is being requested by them. So what are you saying to these frontline nurses who are like, look, they're just rolling it out. We're being told we have to use this. We don't even understand what AI is, and we're being told that we're supposed to trust in the data that's coming from that system. How do we fact check any of this? What needs to happen? And at the end of the day, if all of a sudden one of our system uses this in the ambulatory space and actually hallucinates to a patient, and that's inaccurate information, but I didn't actually, as the nurse on the line, audit that, read that transcript, review that phone call, but ultimately that responsibility fell under me. What are these nurses supposed to do, Brenton? Tell us, how are they supposed to catch up? Because you also said the Board of Nursing is now making them be accountable for all laws and governance in this space, where before, when we would operate in a system and we were told to use a tool, we would have expected that there was a level of understanding by the health system they were providing us a tool that actually is factual, safe to use, and is compliant with the standards that govern healthcare today. So now that we're in this vacuum of space, it's rolling out faster than it's been tested and being held to regulatory standards. What can we tell nurses, Jing and Brenton, based on what's happening in the reality of the situation? We have a perfect world and we're operating in an imperfect one right now. What should they be asking, and how can they defend themselves in these situations when they are not the decision maker on what tools are being rolled out, or are they being the evaluators on those systems, but they're being asked to use them and trust that that is safe to use? At the end of the day, though, it appears that based on all the legislation and the lawsuits that are coming, it will fall on the responsibility of that provider to actually sign off on either the accuracy or the inaccuracy of that engagement. Thoughts? And we will probably be ending there. So please go ahead and give a final thought as well.
You want to go first, Brenton?
Yeah, sure. I'll provide my thoughts as kind of a, someone that's looking at this more globally. I really do think that all clinicians need to be empowered to say no. And what was interesting is, as I've been studying some of the proposed legislation around states, I believe this was in Illinois. I don't think this passed, but I believe in Illinois. Illinois actually wrote in a piece of legislation that allowed nurses to not follow the recommendations of AI and actually be empowered to say no. And that was written into legislation, which I thought was pretty interesting, right? I don't know if that's going to go mainstream. My sense is it probably isn't, because of the dynamic political dynamics. But what I think that highlights for me is that as nurses, and that as people with licenses on the line, you do need to speak up, right? This is the time to say, I'm uncomfortable with this. I need more training. I need more X, Y, and Z. And if you do speak up, and again, nurse leaders really need to advocate for a seat at the table on the technology committees, on the AI governance committees. Because if it is the case that these technologies are being passed down, you have no say in the decision, that's not going to be effective governance. When we look at our CHI recommendations, when we look at what we're proposing, it is very much that people need a seat at the table. People need to understand the technology and ultimately feel comfortable with it and do it. Because otherwise, this technology boom, this great technology that we're seeing, that is going to have dramatic effects, that is going to improve how you perform your functions, we're going to lose trust. People aren't going to use it, and it's going to be like half of the other applications that are installed at our organizations where people don't use them. There's a lot of money wasted on them, and ultimately there's not a lot of adoption. And so that's honestly my greatest fear in this, is that if organizations don't do it right, if organizations don't have strong leadership and strong buy-in from their stakeholders, it's really not going to be about, you know, the technology. It's going to be about the people. And so I think we need to be people-focused leaders, people first. We need to have dynamic leaders that understand the technology, that understand the implications, and that do it. And we need to empower the nurses to speak up. So my parting thought would be, honestly, there's not a lot that you can do, but you can speak up. And if you speak up, people listen. And ultimately, I think that's how things get done. As people have strong positions, they speak up, they challenge the status quo, and you know, things tend to change around that. So,
thank you, Brett. And final thought, Jing?
Yeah, my position is always no fear, no hype. Like we should not go to use agentic generative AI for everything that we do or outsource all of our learning and all of our work to it. It really has to be what is relieving, you know, nurses' time to focus on what we are practicing on the top of our license. I also think we also shouldn't be like no AI. That's never my position as well, because I do feel like AI has huge potential that can really relieve the nurse's burden. So I think my position has always been this in the middle. Demand education training from health systems who are forcing you to implement and adopt AI. We're providing you today with the questions you can be asking, tools where you can easily adopt in establishing governance if your organization doesn't have one already, or how should you incorporate one in your nursing practice councils where you practice, to have a subcommittee in governance and have that committee then supporting. Remember, we talk about, you know, even Joint Commission cares about this. We need to get ready. What if one day we need to be ready for all the tools? So leverage some of the tools that we have introduced to you today to really stand up on your ground on what we need as nurses to safely and effectively leveraging the AI tools to support our work and support our patients. So that will be my parting thoughts. And I also encourage all the nurses. I think we need to be more learning from each other. All of us are learning a lot. A lot of you that are already using, designing, deciding AI tools. And that's part of why we have the consortium. We want to bring everyone together. So we're not wasting our time. I'm learning this, you're learning that. If we're just communicating together, we could have learned much more and advanced the field much more. So I encourage all of you to join us if you are nurses or care about nursing on the consortium. We'll make our slides and recording available to all of our members. It's free to join, and also encourage all of those nurse educators, nurse science, nurse leaders to be really helping us defining the field a little bit more and build our nurses with confidence in what are actually the areas that is the best use of what AI tools. So we get to decide, we get to leverage the power of AI to serve the needs of our nurses and our patients.
Jing, Breton, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. You guys, NAIIC's entire goal is about elevating and bringing the top leading conversations that are not happening regularly in nursing around AI to nurses. So please join us along those lines. Brenton, I have to tell you, the questions that you pose together to help nurses think, you don't need to know all of the questions, but you should know how to put those forward, are going to be some of the most helpful tools that I have seen to guide nurses forward in these conversations from an impactful perspective. Thank you for all of your knowledge and your expertise. We know how busy you are, and also leading in this space, speaking to the most top leading, important individuals in the world on these topics. We take you specifically for taking over an hour with us to educate nurses. For everybody who participated, again, if you are looking for a copy of these recordings, they will be present at NAIIC. In the future, we hope to do more of these. You'll be hearing more from all of us. Again, be curious, speak out, ask questions. The future of healthcare AI is going to be driven by nurses who adopt it, ask the questions, and then actually work forward to make forward for a better future with it. Thank you guys for everybody tuning in to us. Thank you, nurse.org, for hosting this. And for anybody who wants to reach out to us, please find us on LinkedIn and future events. We look forward to seeing you in the future. And for the questions around FSU, yes, we are hoping that there will be a grad certificate that will be present for an AI program shortly. Jing is leading in this space to bring education formally around AI to nurses across the entire platform of utilizing FSU. And we look forward to seeing you guys in the future with us there. Thank you, everybody. We are going to be signing off.